So we'll have Ben step up and present to us first. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Don. So Don asked me to give a perspective on how GIS fits into CMSP, or Coastal and Marine Spatial Planning. So in the United States, that's the name and acronym that's being used, but in Europe and Australia and other parts of the world, they just call it Marine Spatial Planning. And actually the ideas grew more from Europe, but quickly became relevant to the United States, in particular through direct reference in the National Ocean Policy. I'm going to keep my remarks very 30,000 feet, kind of big picture, getting a sense of how GIS fits into this planning process and where there, I think, are real opportunities and needs to develop new tools and capabilities, both scientifically, but then on an actual sort of Esri-type platform for helping inform these decisions. So I think, no surprise, ecological information plays a key role in this kind of CMSP planning, so you can get information on species diversity or locations, abundance patterns, and whatnot. And all this ecological information sets a foundation for the species and the processes that are happening in different places in the ocean. These species produce the services that are being managed within a CMSP process. And of course, where those species are and how productive they are is heavily influenced by oceanographic processes, which are very spatial and dynamic. So we need information spatially on how those processes are influencing the ecological processes and how spatial planning can account for those patterns. But then I think what has traditionally gotten less attention, but is increasingly important in CMSP processes with the focus on services rather than just natural systems, are economic and a few other factors. So here's just an example of the spatial pattern, in this case, of energy leases off the Santa Barbara County coast. You can see there's all sorts of use. Well, you can't see the legends, impossible to read, but there's oil and gas leases, wind energy leases, and other kinds of spatial allocation of uses in the ocean that are about economic value delivered to people. And so there's a whole layer of these economics, fishing is another example, that play into the decision-making process of where things should be allowed and prohibited. Another example, of course, is the shipping pattern. So this is the work that comes out of our cumulative impact mapping. It's just a snapshot, but clearly shipping routes are a major use of the oceans, and if you have to alter the route, it has important economic consequences for the shipping companies. You layer on top of that political information about regulations and jurisdictional boundaries that are county and state and federal and so on, that all overlap and intersect and guide what can happen where and to what degree. And so again, it's a spatial component to feed into this planning process. Here's another example from the recent Marine Life Protection Act in California that set up a network of marine protected areas. It's a regulatory process that created spatial output that influences the interactions of people with species and nature and different uses by people. And then finally, this is something that from my perspective, has gotten far too little attention in the planning process, and especially from a spatial GIS perspective. Obviously, demographers think about these kind of social patterns all the time, but it hasn't been fed into the planning process within things like CMSP as much as it should be. There's all sorts of social dimensions on where people are, what type of people they are, what they're interested in getting from the ocean, how they interact with each other, the social dynamics, the social structure, the network design of the communities. All of these factors are really important for influencing what will come out of a particular ocean region as we try to plan and manage for it. So again, all of these factors, and this isn't probably a complete list, but all of these are spatially explicit information that need to be fed into a planning process in a GIS kind of platform. So I want to spend the second part of this short presentation highlighting what I see are 5, at least, areas that are kind of at the cusp or cutting edge of the academic work that's going on, and something I think that could really benefit from development on GIS tools to help support those research endeavors and the planning process that needs to incorporate these kinds of ideas. So the first one is sort of dealing with and visualizing the idea of uncertainty. So all information has some amount of uncertainty to it. Some of it is more uncertain than others, and the level of uncertainty and the nature of that uncertainty will have a large impact on how you design spatial plans for informing the sustainable use of oceans. And so some of this can be visualization to help communicate that uncertainty. So there are already some tools for that within Esri products as well as other things. But there's also an analytical component that needs tools that can help account for and process that uncertainty as you start to layer on all these different types of information: ecological, oceanographic, economic, social, political. All of them have their own type of uncertainty, and that has to be propagated through the system to see what the consequences of that are. We've heard reference to this already, and we all know this well, but dealing with time within space is obviously really important. Species move, oceanographic currents move, humans' uses move. All of these temporal dynamics are really important for thinking about spatial planning, but we need to develop the tools and the science for how to do these sort of coupled spatial temporal dynamics into our planning process and our understanding of how spatial actions in management will affect these temporal dynamics and how the temporal dynamics affect the spatial planning. A third one, and this ties in, I think, to the kinds of stuff that C-Sketch has been working on, but there's no way that we can ever rely on federal agencies or private businesses to provide us all the information that we need in order to do more effective coastal marine spatial planning. So we really need to come up with more effective and more robust ways of engaging citizen science in this process. But it's not just engaging them, we need to curate that information to make sure that we have some way to quantify the accuracy or the robustness of it. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for developing these kinds of tools that can be from mobile apps if you're in a developed country that's got smartphones, or just simple cell phone technology to gather information that's geolocated and then about how people are interacting with and using ocean resources and fold that information into the planning process. I think there's a lot of really neat opportunity but challenges there. The fourth one, and this is one I've dealt with a lot in my own research, is just when you start to do these really comprehensive marine spatial planning efforts, whether it's even if at local scales, but certainly at global scales, you just have massive amounts of really big data sets. And when you're trying to integrate and synthesize within and among those data sets, there just are real challenges. And I think the more that tools can be developed to help simplify that, it'll help science and planning move beyond the data integration issues into actual analytics and solutions. And then finally, I just raise a point that isn't unique to the oceans by any means, but it's obviously very important in the oceans. It's just the connectivity, the spatial connectivity among places. So it's representing and understanding that what's happening in one place is affected by many other places. And there are tools developed for land-based planning already that think about corridors and movement of species and the sort of network connection among locations. But I think there's a lot of need and opportunity to further develop and advance and refine those tools to think about species movement, oceanographic current movement, the connectivity of human impacts from one place on another that are transported through different means, through atmosphere and the ocean, to kind of link the whole system. And so the more that we can build in this connectivity into our analytics and the tools, the better we can represent a system and therefore plan rationally for the outcomes that we want to get from planning.